The teacup slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Her mother's body lay crumpled at the bottom of the stairs. Vivian was 7 months pregnant, and in 48 hours she would be arrested for murder. But here's what the police didn't know. Her husband had been planning this for 3 years. Every kiss, every I love you, every romantic gesture, all of it was a calculated lie. Because Eleanor Ashford wasn't just a retired school teacher, she was a secret trillionaire, worth $1.3 trillion, and Vivian was her sole heir. Grant Porter didn't marry Vivian for love. He married her for access, for inheritance, for a fortune he would kill to possess. He poisoned her mother. He planted the evidence. He framed his pregnant wife for murder, and he almost got away with it. Almost. Because Grant made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the woman he married. This is the story of how a pregnant woman, locked in a jail cell, facing life in prison, brought down the monster who destroyed her family, and what she discovered about love, betrayal, and the strength she never knew she had. Story value and meaning. This story carries a powerful message for every woman who has ever ignored the warning signs, who has ever made herself small to keep the peace, who has ever loved someone so much that she forgot to love herself first. The truth is this: love is not about being rescued. Love is about rescuing yourself. Eleanor Ashford taught her daughter that the strongest people are the ones who survive their own stories, and Vivian proved it. No matter how dark the night becomes, no matter how powerful your enemy seems, no matter how alone you feel, you have strength inside you that you haven't discovered yet. Sometimes rock bottom is the solid foundation you need to rebuild everything. The teacup slipped from Vivian's fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Her mother's body lay crumpled at the bottom of the stairs. For 3 heartbeats, Vivian stood frozen in the doorway of the Ashford estate. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden light across Eleanor's twisted form. Her mother's favorite blue cardigan was bunched beneath her shoulders. One slipper had fallen off, revealing pale feet with perfectly polished nails. No, this was wrong. This was all wrong. Vivian's hand found the wall. Her knees threatened to buckle. The baby shifted inside her, a flutter of movement that felt obscene in this moment of absolute stillness. She forced herself forward. Each step echoed in the silent foyer. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, indifferent to the horror below. Eleanor's eyes were open, fixed on the crystal chandelier above. Vivian had always loved that chandelier. Eleanor had bought it in Paris on their first trip together, when Vivian was 12 years old and still learning to trust that this woman would not abandon her like everyone else had. Vivian knelt beside her mother. Her pregnant belly made the movement awkward, but she managed. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched Eleanor's hand, cold, so cold. The scream that tore from Vivian's throat sounded like it belonged to someone else. A wounded animal. A woman watching her entire world collapse into splinters. She cradled Eleanor's cold hand against her cheek. The tears came hot and fast, blurring her vision. Through the haze, she noticed things. Small details that would haunt her later. The bruise forming on Eleanor's temple, the strange angle of her neck, the way her mother's reading glasses lay broken 3 feet away as if thrown. The front door burst open behind her. Grant rushed in, his footsteps sharp against the marble. His hands gripped Vivian's shoulders, pulling her back from Eleanor's body. Vivian, Vivian, look at me. She turned her tear-streaked face toward her husband. Grant's expression was arranged into concern, but something flickered behind his eyes, something she would only recognize later, when it was far too late. What happened? He asked. I don't know. I just got here. She was already Vivian couldn't finish the sentence. The words died in her throat. Grant pulled her against his chest. His shirt was wrinkled. She noticed distantly. Strange. He always left the house in crisp, ironed shirts. He was obsessive about his appearance. She must have fallen, Grant said. His voice was steady, too steady. The stairs are so steep. I always told her to be careful. Vivian pulled back slightly. When did you tell her that? What? You said you always told her. When? Grant's eyes flickered, just for a moment. Then his expression smoothed into grief. You're in shock, sweetheart. We need to call 911. He already had his phone out, already dialing. Vivian watched him pace toward the window, speaking in measured tones to the emergency operator. Yes, my wife found her mother. She's hysterical. It looks like she fell down the stairs. No, she's not breathing. The body is cold. The body. He called Eleanor the body. Vivian's stomach turned. She pressed her hand against her belly where their daughter kicked in protest. 7 months along. 7 months of planning the nursery and picking names and imagining Eleanor holding her granddaughter for the first time. None of that would happen now. The paramedics arrived first, then the police. The house filled with strangers wearing latex gloves and grim expressions. Someone wrapped a blanket around Vivian's shoulders. Someone else pressed a cup of water into her hands. She drank without tasting it. A man in a rumpled suit approached her. His badge identified him as Detective Marcus Webb. He had kind eyes, she thought. Tired, but kind. Mrs. Porter, I'm so sorry for your loss. Can I ask you a few questions? Vivian nodded. Words seemed impossible. When did you arrive at the house this morning? 9:15. We have brunch every Sunday. Had brunch. The past tense felt like swallowing glass. And your husband? He was in the car, parking. He came in right after I found her. Detective Webb wrote something in his notebook. Was anyone else expected this morning? No, just us. It was always just us, on Sundays. Grant appeared at her side. His hand found her elbow, squeezing gently. Detective, my wife is 7 months pregnant. She's had a terrible shock. Is this really necessary right now? Webb's eyes moved between them, assessing. Just a few more questions, Mr. Porter, then I'll let you take her home. Vivian heard them talking, but the words blurred together. She stared at the stairs, at the spot where Eleanor's body had lain. The paramedics had covered her with a white sheet before taking her away. Now, there was just empty marble and the ghost of her mother's presence. She found herself moving toward the kitchen. Her feet carried her, without conscious thought. The kettle sat on the counter, cold and empty. Eleanor always had tea ready when Vivian arrived. Earl Grey, with a splash of milk. Vivian picked up the kettle and turned on the tap. Water rushed out, filling the vessel. She watched it rise and rise, Roisin, her mind completely blank. The water overflowed. It splashed across her hands, soaking her sleeves, pooling on the counter. Still she stood there, holding the kettle under the running tap, unable to stop. Vivian? Grant's voice came from somewhere far away. Vivian, what are you doing? She turned off the water, set down the kettle, stared at her wet hands as if they belonged to a stranger. I was making tea, she whispered. Grant guided her away from the counter. His touch felt unfamiliar somehow, like wearing someone else's clothes. Let's get you home, he said. Detective Webb appeared in the kitchen doorway. His expression had shifted. Something harder lurked beneath the sympathy now. Actually, Mr. Porter, I'm going to need you both to come down to the station. Just routine. We need formal statements. Grant's hand tightened on Vivian's elbow. Can't this wait? My wife needs rest. I'm afraid not. Webb's tone left no room for negotiation. They followed him outside. The morning had turned gray, clouds rolling in from the east. Vivian climbed into the back of an unmarked car. Grant sat beside her, his thigh pressed against hers. As they pulled away from the estate, Grant leaned close to her ear. His breath was warm against her skin. "Don't mention the inheritance talk from last week," he whispered. Vivian's blood turned to ice. "What inheritance talk?" She turned to look at her husband. His profile was sharp against the window. Jaw set, eyes forward. Eleanor had mentioned updating her will. Just a passing comment over lunch. Nothing significant, Vivian had thought. Eleanor lived modestly. A comfortable house, some savings, nothing worth mentioning to Grant. But Grant's hands were shaking now, not with grief, with something else entirely. Vivian pressed her palm against her belly. Her daughter kicked again, strong and insistent. Something was very, very wrong. The interrogation room smelled like stale coffee and fear. Vivian had been sitting in the same plastic chair for 6 hours. Her back ached. Her ankles were swollen. The baby had stopped moving an hour ago, settling into sleep while her mother's world fell apart. Detective Webb sat across from her. A manila folder lay between them, thick with papers she couldn't see. "Can I get you something?" he asked. "Water? Something to eat?" "No, thank you." Vivian's voice came out as a croak. "Can you just tell me what's happening? Where's my husband?" "Mr. Porter is in another room, giving his statement." Webb leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Porter, I need to ask you some difficult questions. I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "When was the last time you saw your mother alive?" "Thursday evening. We had dinner together. Grant was working late, so it was just the two of us." "How did she seem?" Vivian closed her eyes. Thursday felt like a lifetime ago. "Happy. She was excited about the baby. She'd been knitting a blanket. Yellow, because we don't know the gender yet." Her voice cracked. She pressed her hand against her mouth, holding back the sob that threatened to escape. Webb waited, patient, watchful. "Did your mother have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt her?" Vivian shook her head. "Everyone loved Eleanor. She was the kindest person I've ever known. She took me in when I was 7 years old. I was nobody. A foster kid nobody wanted. And she chose me." The tears came again. Vivian wiped them away with the back of her hand. Her mascara had long since smeared into dark circles under her eyes. Webb opened the manila folder. He pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. Vivian looked down. A small brown bottle. Prescription medication. The label was partially visible. "Do you recognize this?" Webb asked. "It's my mother's heart medication, Digitalis." "When did you last handle this bottle?" Vivian frowned. "Last week. Wednesday, I think. Mom asked me to help organize her pill case. She gets confused sometimes about which medication to take when." Gets confused. Present tense. The correction hit her like a physical blow. Got confused. Past tense now. Everything about Eleanor was past tense. Webb's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Porter, this bottle was found at the scene. We ran it for fingerprints. Okay? Your fingerprints were the only ones on it." Vivian blinked. "Well, yes, I just told you. I organized her medications last week. The medical examiner has completed his preliminary report." Webb's voice was gentle, but his words were anything but. "Your mother didn't die from a fall, Mrs. Porter. She was poisoned." The room tilted. Vivian gripped the edge of the table. "What?" "Digitalis overdose. Massive. The fall happened after she was already dying. Someone staged the scene to look like an accident." "That's impossible." Vivian's heart pounded against her ribs. "Who would poison my mother? She was a retired school teacher. She had no enemies." Webb pulled another photograph from the folder. Crime scene tape. Eleanor's body at the bottom of the stairs. "The only fingerprints on the medication that killed her belong to you, Mrs. Porter. You were the last person to handle that bottle. Because I was helping her organize her pills. Vivian's voice rose. I didn't know someone was going to use them to kill her. Did you know about the new will? Vivian froze. What new will? Your mother updated her estate documents 3 weeks ago. You're the sole beneficiary. I knew she was updating something. She mentioned it casually, but I assumed it was minor. She lives simply. A house, some savings. Webb studied her for a long moment. Then he pulled a final document from the folder. Mrs. Porter, I'm going to read you your rights. The world stopped. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. The words washed over Vivian like waves of ice water. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She was 7 months pregnant. Her mother was dead, and now this detective thought she was a murderer. No. The word came out small, desperate. No, I didn't do this. I would never hurt Eleanor. She was my mother. She saved my life. Webb finished reading her rights. His expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, maybe, or pity. Do you understand these rights as I've explained them? Yes, but I'm innocent. Please, you have to believe me. The door opened. Grant stepped inside, followed by a man in an expensive suit. I've arranged for an attorney, Grant said. His voice was calm, controlled. She's not answering any more questions without legal representation. Vivian looked up at her husband. His face was arranged into concern. The worried husband standing by his wrongly accused wife. But his eyes were wrong. There was no fear in them, no confusion, no desperation to understand what was happening. Instead, she saw something that made her stomach clench. Relief. Grant looked relieved. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She remembered his whisper in the car, "Don't mention the inheritance talk." She remembered his wrinkled shirt when he arrived at the scene, his steady voice on the phone with the operator, the way he called Eleanor the body without flinching. He knew. Grant knew about the medication. He knew her fingerprints were on that bottle. He had been there that day, watching as she organized Eleanor's pills. I'm not crazy, I saw his face. He was relieved when they said murder. Relieved. Vivian looked at the man she had married, the father of her unborn child, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. The attorney was speaking, something about bail and charges. Vivian heard none of it. She was trapped inside her own head, replaying every moment of the last 3 years. Grant pursuing her at that charity event, the whirlwind romance, the proposal after only 6 months, Eleanor's hesitation at the wedding, the way she had looked at Grant across the dinner table and said nothing. Just looked. Vivian had ignored it. She had wanted to be loved so badly that she had ignored everything. And now she was sitting in an interrogation room, accused of murdering the only person who had ever truly loved her. They booked her that night. Fingerprints, photographs, the orange jumpsuit that barely fit over her pregnant belly, the clang of metal doors closing behind her. Her mugshot would be on the news by morning. Pregnant woman accused of murdering her wealthy mother. The story wrote itself. Grant promised to hire the best lawyers. He promised to stand by her. He kissed her forehead through the bars and told her everything would be okay. Vivian watched him walk away. His shoulders were straight, his stride confident. He wasn't worried at all. Because he already knew how this story ended. The jail cell measured 8 feet by 10. Vivian knew because she had counted the concrete blocks. Twice 3 days had passed since her arrest. 3 days of processed food she couldn't stomach. 3 days of fluorescent lights that never turned off. 3 days of her daughter kicking against her ribs, demanding attention that Vivian could barely give. When the guard announced she had a visitor, Vivian assumed it was Grant. Instead, A woman in a tailored charcoal suit waited in the visitation room. "Mrs. Porter, I'm Celeste Drummond, your mother's attorney." Vivian lowered herself carefully into the plastic chair. "I don't understand. Grant said he was handling the legal arrangements." Celeste's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes. "I represent Eleanor Ashford's estate, not your husband." She opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "There are things you need to know." "About what?" Celeste's Titon slid a document across the table. The pages were dense with legal language, but one number jumped out immediately: $1.3 trillion. Vivian stared at the figure. Her brain refused to process it. "This is a mistake," she whispered. "It's not." Celeste's voice was steady. "Your mother was the anonymous founder of Ashford Holdings, technology patents, commercial real estate, pharmaceutical investments, art collections worth hundreds of millions. She built an empire over 40 years, and she hid every penny of it." "That's impossible." "She lived in a 4-bedroom house. She drove a Honda. She clipped coupons." By choice. Eleanor believed wealth was a responsibility, not a lifestyle. She donated billions anonymously. She funded scholarships for foster children across the country. She changed countless lives without ever putting her name on a building. Vivian thought of all the Sundays spent in Eleanor's modest kitchen, the home-cooked meals, the thrift store sweaters, the quiet woman who had saved a 7-year-old girl from the foster system and never asked for gratitude in return. A trillionaire. Her mother had been a trillionaire. 3 weeks ago, Eleanor updated her will, Celeste continued. "You are the sole heir to her entire estate." The room spun. Vivian gripped the edge of the table. "Why didn't she tell me?" "She planned to. After the baby was born, she wanted you settled first." Celeste paused. "There's more, Mrs. Porter. The will contains a specific clause. If you are convicted of Eleanor's murder, or if you die before the estate is settled, the inheritance reverts to a charitable trust. So it doesn't go to Grant. No, under no circumstances does your husband inherit a single dollar." Vivian's hands began to shake. The pieces were falling into place. Horrible, devastating pieces that formed a picture she couldn't unsee. "He knew," she said. "Grant knew about the money." Celeste's silence was confirmation enough. "How long?" "I can't say for certain. But your mother suspected he had discovered the truth approximately 18 months ago. She noticed changes in his behavior, questions about her finances, interest in her business affairs that seemed sudden and excessive. 18 months. Vivian calculated backwards. That was when Grant had started talking about having children, when he had suggested they spend more time with Eleanor, when he had begun inserting himself into every family gathering. She had thought he was trying to bond with her mother, building a relationship with his mother-in-law, being a good husband. He was positioning himself, calculating, waiting. "If I'm convicted," Vivian said slowly, "the money goes to charity. Grant gets nothing, correct? But if I'm alive and free, I inherit everything, also correct. And as my husband, he would have access to that fortune." Celeste nodded. "Community property laws would entitle him to a significant portion of any assets acquired during your marriage, unless, of course, you divorce him before the estate is settled." Vivian laughed. The sound was hollow, broken. She had married a con man, a predator who had seen her vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision. Every romantic gesture, every whispered, "I love you," every plan for their future together, lies, all of it. She wasn't his wife. She was his investment, his pathway to unimaginable wealth, And when that pathway required removing an obstacle, Grant had done exactly that. He killed Eleanor. The certainty settled into Vivian's bones like ice. She had no proof, no evidence beyond the intuition that screamed inside her head, but she knew Grant had murdered her mother, and he had framed her to take the fall. "What do I do?" Vivian's voice came out as a whisper. "You fight." Celeste gathered the documents back into her briefcase. "Your mother believed in you, Mrs. Porter. She chose you when you were 7 years old, and she never stopped choosing you. Don't let the man who killed her destroy everything she built." After Celeste left, Vivian sat alone in her cell. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Through the small window, she could see a sliver of gray sky. She placed both hands on her belly. Her daughter shifted beneath her palms. Strong, insistent, alive. Eleanor had taught her many things over the years. How to read a balance sheet, how to bake bread from scratch, how to stand up straight when the world tried to push her down. But the most important lesson was this: the strongest people are the ones who survive their own stories. I will survive this story, Mom. I promise. For the first time since her arrest, Vivian stopped crying. She started planning. The television in the common area played footage of Grant's press conference. Vivian watched from behind bulletproof glass, her orange jumpsuit marking her as separate from the free world beyond. "My wife is innocent," Grant said into a cluster of microphones. His voice trembled with practiced emotion. "I stand by her completely. We are working with authorities to clear her name." A reporter shouted a question. "Mr. Porter, what do you say to those who believe your wife killed Eleanor Ashford for her inheritance?" Grant's expression crumbled artfully. "My mother-in-law was a wonderful woman. She lived simply. She had no enemies. The idea that Vivian would harm her for money is absurd. We didn't even know the extent of her estate until after her death." Liar. Vivian's hands curled into fists at her sides. He was so smooth, so convincing. The grieving son-in-law standing by his wrongly accused wife. The cameras loved him. What they didn't show was Grant's lawyer filing papers to contest Eleanor's will. What they didn't report was the motion claiming Vivian was mentally unstable, unfit to manage her own affairs, in need of a conservator named Grant Porter. "Mrs. Porter?" A guard appeared at her elbow. "Your attorney is here." Vivian expected Celeste. Instead, she found Detective Webb waiting in the visitation room. He looked tired. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights. His suit was more rumpled than before. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said without preamble. "This is off the record." Vivian sat down slowly. "Then why are you here?" "Because something doesn't add up." Webb pulled a chair close to the glass partition. "The evidence against you is too clean, too perfect. In 30 years of homicide work, I've never seen a case wrapped up this neatly." "You think I'm innocent?" "I think someone wants me to believe you're guilty." He leaned forward. "Real criminals make mistakes. They leave loose ends. They panic. The evidence in this case reads like a screenplay, every piece perfectly placed to point at you." Vivian's heart began to pound. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to keep digging, but I need something from you. I need you to think. Is there anyone who might want your mother dead? Anyone who would benefit from you going to prison?" Grant's face flashed through her mind. His relief when the word murder was spoken, his steady hands, his knowing eyes. "My husband," she whispered. Webb didn't look surprised. "Why do you say that?" "He knew about my mother's fortune, long before I did. He married me to get to her money." The words tumbled out faster now. "He was there when I handled her medication. He could have planted evidence. He could have—" She couldn't finish, couldn't say the words out loud. Webb studied her for a long moment. I can't promise anything, but I'm not giving up on this case. He left before the guard could ask questions. Vivian sat alone, processing what had just happened. Someone believed her, someone with the power to investigate. It wasn't much, but it was something. 2 hours later, Margot Sullivan arrived for visiting hours. Vivian's best friend since college looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her red hair was pulled into a messy bun. Her eyes were fierce with determination. "I've been digging," Margot said without preamble. "Grant's credit card has charges at the same pharmacy that sold the Digitalis compound 2 weeks before Eleanor died." Vivian's breath caught. "What?" "I'm not a cop, but I watch enough true crime to know that's not a coincidence." Margot pulled a notebook from her purse. Pages and pages of handwritten notes. "I've been tracking his movements, his finances, his past relationships." "Margot, you could get in trouble. Honey, I've been biting my tongue about that man for 3 years. Time to start talking." She flipped to a marked page. Grant was expelled from his college for a hazing incident that got covered up. His family paid to make it disappear. But the details are still out there, if you know where to look. Sweet. What kind of hazing incident? The kind that hospitalized another student. The kind that should have resulted in criminal charges. Margot's expression darkened. This isn't the first time Grant has hurt someone and walked away clean. The weight of this information pressed down on Vivian's chest. The man she had married, the father of her child. A predator with a history of violence. "There's more," Margot continued. "I found 3 ex-girlfriends, all from wealthy families. One of them had a grandmother who died unexpectedly right after Grant started dating her. No, the death was ruled natural causes, heart failure. But the timing is suspicious as hell. Everyone else sees a grieving husband. I see the man who killed my mother and is killing me slowly." The truth crystallized in Vivian's mind with terrible clarity. Grant had done this before, maybe not murder, but manipulation, exploitation, using women as stepping stones to wealth. She wasn't his first victim. She was just the one who got close enough to become dangerous. "We need to find proof," Vivian said. "Something concrete, something that will hold up in court." "I'm working on it." Margot squeezed her hand through the glass partition. "You're not alone in this, Viv. I'm going to help you destroy that man." For the first time in days, Vivian felt something other than despair. She felt anger, and anger, she was beginning to realize, could be useful. The jail's visiting room smelled like bleach and despair. Vivian had grown accustomed to the scent over the past 2 weeks. It clung to her clothes, her skin, her hair. She wondered if she would ever smell anything else again. A man she didn't recognize sat across from her. He was in his mid-30s, with nervous eyes and a suit that didn't quite fit. "My name is Tucker Briggs," he said. "I was Grant's college roommate." Vivian's pulse quickened. "Margot found you. She's very persuasive." Tucker glanced around the room as if expecting Grant to materialize from the shadows. "I probably shouldn't be here. Grant has a way of making problems disappear. I'm aware." Tucker fidgeted with his tie. "Look, I've stayed quiet for 15 years, convinced myself that what I saw wasn't what I thought it was. But then I heard about your mother, about what happened to you." He met her eyes, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "What did you see?" "Grant's senior year, he started dating this girl, Caroline Whitfield. Her family owned half of Connecticut. Old money, the kind of wealth that comes with trust funds and summer homes." Vivian waited. Her hands were steady, but her heart raced. Caroline's grandmother was in poor health, heart problems. Grant used to visit her at the nursing home, brought flowers, charmed the staff. Tucker's voice dropped. 3 months after Grant started those visits, the grandmother died. Caroline inherited everything. "And Grant?" Proposed to Caroline 2 weeks later. They were engaged for about 6 months before she called it off. Said she had found out something about him, something she couldn't forgive. What was it? She never told me, but I remember the look on her face when she handed back the ring, like she had seen like a monster wearing a human mask. Tucker swallowed hard. Grant didn't take it well. Caroline moved to Europe shortly after, changed her name, disappeared completely. The pieces continued falling into place. Grant's pattern was emerging. Wealthy women, vulnerable family members, convenient deaths. Will you testify? Vivian asked. Tucker hesitated. If it comes to that, but you need to understand something. Grant is smart, smarter than anyone gives him credit for. He's been getting away with this for years because he knows how to cover his tracks. Then how do we stop him? His ego. Tucker leaned forward. That's his weakness. He can't stand being underestimated. If you push him hard enough, he'll slip up. He'll need everyone to know how clever he is. Vivian filed this information away. Grant's arrogance, his need for recognition. These could be weapons if she knew how to use them. After Tucker left, Vivian had another unexpected visitor. Noelle Ashford stood in the doorway of the visitation room. Eleanor's biological daughter. The woman who had been estranged from her mother for 20 years. Noelle was tall and angular, with Eleanor's gray eyes, but none of her warmth. She moved like a woman, perpetually braced for a fight. So you're the replacement, Noelle said. Her voice was sharp, bitter. I'm not anyone's replacement. Really? Because my mother cut me off and adopted you instead. Gave you everything that should have been mine. Vivian's anger flared. Your mother cut you off because you stole from her to buy drugs. She gave you a dozen chances to get clean. You threw every one of them away. Noelle flinched. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face. Then the hardness returned. I didn't come here to fight about ancient history, she said. I came because that husband of yours needs to be stopped. Vivian blinked. What? Grant Porter has been sniffing around my mother's money for years. I may have been estranged from her, but I wasn't blind. Noelle dropped into the chair across from Vivian. He visited her alone the night before she died. The world stopped. What did you say? I drove by the house that Saturday night. I was thinking about reaching out, trying again. Noelle's voice cracked slightly. Grant's car was in the driveway. He was inside with her for over an hour. Did you tell the police? I'm telling you. Noelle met her eyes. I spent 20 years hating you for taking my place in my mother's life, but I hated Grant more from the moment I met him. Something about that man made my skin crawl. Vivian processed this information. Grant had been alone with Eleanor the night before she died. He had opportunity. He had motive. And now, she had a witness. Why are you helping me? She asked. Noelle was quiet for a long moment. Because my mother loved you. She chose you when she couldn't save me. And despite everything, I know she never stopped hoping I would find my way back. Tears pricked at Vivian's eyes. She talked about you. Every Sunday, she kept your baby pictures on her dresser. Noelle's composure cracked. She pressed her hand against her mouth, holding back a sob. I wasted 20 years, she whispered. 20 years being angry at the wrong person. The two women sat in silence, enemies becoming allies, in the shadow of their shared loss. Eleanor would have wanted this, Vivian realized. She would have wanted her daughters, biological and chosen, to find each other, to fight together. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and right now, they both had the same enemy. The bail hearing was a spectacle. Grant sat in the gallery, surrounded by cameras and sympathizers. He played his role perfectly. The devoted husband, the wrongly suffering innocent. Vivian sat at the defendant's table in her orange jumpsuit, her pregnant belly pressing against the cold wood. She hadn't slept in days. The baby was restless, shifting constantly. The prosecutor presented his case with clinical efficiency, fingerprints on the murder weapon, motive in the form of a massive inheritance, opportunity during the Sunday brunch visits. The defense attorney Grant had hired was competent but uninspired. He raised procedural objections. Questioned the chain of evidence. Did everything by the book. Nothing that would actually set her free. When the judge denied bail, Vivian wasn't surprised. Flight risk, danger to herself, the usual justifications that meant nothing when applied to a pregnant woman accused of murdering her own mother. Grant approached the barrier separating them. His expression was arranged into devastation. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'll keep fighting for you." Vivian looked at him. Really looked at him, searching for any trace of the man she thought she had married. There was nothing there, just a performance, a mask covering emptiness. "I know what you did," she whispered. Grant's expression didn't change. "You're under tremendous stress, I understand. I know you killed her. I know you set me up. And I know you're going to pay for it." Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or contempt. "Get some rest, Vivian. You're not thinking clearly." The guards led her away, back to the van, back to the cell that would be her home until the trial. That night was the longest of her life. The jail was never truly quiet. Distant coughs, muffled sobs, the clang of metal doors and the shuffle of guards' footsteps. But in her cell, surrounded by concrete walls and the buzz of fluorescent lights, Vivian felt completely alone. She lay on the thin mattress, hands pressed against her belly. The baby was still now, sleeping, perhaps, or simply giving her mother a moment of peace. She thought about giving up. The idea crept in like a cold wind through a cracked window, just for a moment, just a fleeting consideration. What if she stopped fighting? What if she let Grant win? Let the system grind her down until there was nothing left? It would be easier, so much easier. The tears came then, hot and relentless, soaking into the flat pillow beneath her head. She cried for Eleanor, for the mother who had saved her and been taken too soon. She cried for herself, for the naive woman who had believed in fairy tales and happy endings. She cried for her daughter, the child who would be born into this nightmare, who might never know freedom, who might grow up believing her mother was a murderer. At 3 a.m, something shifted. The baby kicked. Hard, harder than she ever had before, as if demanding attention, as if refusing to let Vivian surrender. Eleanor's voice echoed in her memory. "The world will try to break you. Your job is to break back." Vivian placed both hands on her belly. She felt her daughter's movement beneath her palms, strong, insistent, alive. "I won't let my daughter be born thinking her mother was a murderer. I won't let Eleanor's killer raise her child." The despair didn't disappear, but something new rose alongside it, a determination forged in the darkest hour. She had been holding her breath for 3 years. Around Grant, she had learned to make herself small, quiet, agreeable. She stopped having opinions, stopped having friends who questioned him, stopped trusting her own instincts. She let herself disappear, and look where that got her. No more. The woman who made herself small was gone. In her place, something harder was emerging, something that refused to break. I didn't see it because I didn't want to. But that doesn't make this my fault. He counted on my love. He weaponized it. But love wasn't a weakness. Eleanor had taught her that. Love was strength. Love was choosing someone when no one else would. Love was fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. Grant had underestimated her. He had seen a vulnerable woman desperate to be loved, an easy target, a stepping stone to wealth. He hadn't seen the girl who survived the foster system, the woman who built a life from nothing, The daughter Eleanor Ashford chose and raised to be unbreakable. His mistake. Vivian wiped her tears. She sat up in the darkness, and she began to plan. The visitor request came as a complete surprise. Raymond Ashford, Eleanor's older brother, a man who had been estranged from his sister for over 3 decades. Vivian had never met him. Eleanor rarely spoke of her family. The few times she mentioned Raymond, her eyes grew distant, sad. Now, he sat across from her in the visitation room, 80 years old, with sharp blue eyes and a military bearing that time hadn't softened. He looked nothing like Eleanor. Harder, more weathered, but there was something familiar in the set of his jaw. "You don't know me," he said, "but I know you." Vivian waited. "Eleanor and I had a falling out 40 years ago. My fault entirely. Too much pride, too much stubbornness." He paused. "We never reconciled. But she sent me photographs, letters, updates about her life, about you. She never mentioned you." "I asked her not to. I didn't want to explain my absence to a child I had never met." Raymond's voice cracked slightly. "A mistake I will regret until the day I die." Vivian felt no sympathy. This man had abandoned Eleanor, had let his pride create a gulf that lasted decades. What right did he have to show up now, when it was too late? "Why are you here?" she asked. "Because I watched your husband's press conference." Raymond's eyes hardened, and I recognized what I saw. "What do you mean?" "I spent 40 years in the intelligence community, CIA. I've interrogated terrorists and dictators, men who lie for a living." He leaned forward. "Your husband is lying. Every word, every gesture, every carefully crafted expression. He's performing." "I know." "Most people don't see it. They see a grieving man standing by his wife, but I see the calculation behind his eyes, the way he's already spending money he doesn't have." Vivian's pulse quickened. "How do you know about his spending?" "I've been investigating him since the morning Eleanor died." Raymond pulled a folder from his briefcase. "Grant Porter is in significant debt. Credit cards maxed out. Personal loans he can't repay. He's been living beyond his means for years. He was waiting for the inheritance." "Exactly, and now he's getting desperate." Raymond slid the folder across the table. "He's made mistakes, small ones, but enough to build a case." Vivian opened the folder. Bank statements, credit card receipts, a timeline of Grant's movements in the weeks before Eleanor's death. "This is evidence." "It's a start." Raymond met her eyes. "I'm going to fund your defense. The best lawyers in the country, private investigators, expert witnesses, whatever it takes." "Why would you do that?" "Because my sister loved you. She chose you, and I failed her for 40 years. His voice roughened with emotion. "I can't change the past, but I can make sure her killer doesn't destroy her legacy." The weight of his words settled over Vivian. For the first time since her arrest, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. 2 days later, a new attorney appeared at the jail. Victoria Chase was a former federal prosecutor with a reputation for taking impossible cases and winning. She moved like a shark circling prey. "I've reviewed everything," Victoria said. "The evidence against you is circumstantial at best. Fingerprints on a medication you legitimately handled. Search history that could have been planted by anyone with your laptop password. A witness who conveniently heard an argument that never happened." "Grant paid that witness," Vivian said. "Margot found the connection. Which is why I've hired investigators to dig deeper." Victoria smiled. "Your husband made a critical error. He assumed no one would look past the obvious suspect." "What have you found?" "Tucker Briggs has agreed to testify about Grant's past patterns. Noel Ashford will confirm his visit to Eleanor the night before she died. And Victoria paused for dramatic effect. The pharmacy where the Digitalis compound was purchased has security footage showing a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses. The build matches your husband's exactly. That's not enough for an identification. Not yet. But we're working on an enhancement. The technology has come a long way. Victoria gathered her papers. There's something else. Your obstetrician, Dr. Patricia Keene, has come forward with records. What kind of records? Documentation of appointments where you expressed concerns about your husband, worries about his controlling behavior, his obsession with your mother's finances. Victoria's expression softened. And most importantly, an ultrasound appointment that provides you with an alibi for the time period when those incriminating laptop searches were conducted. Vivian's breath caught. I was at the doctor's office. You were, which means someone else made those searches using your laptop. Victoria stood. We're building a case, Mrs. Porter, piece by piece. Your husband isn't as clever as he thinks. After Victoria left, Vivian allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The walls were closing in on Grant. Slowly, carefully, but undeniably. He thought he had won. He thought she was broken, defeated, waiting to be convicted and forgotten. He had no idea what was coming. Grant's facade was cracking. Vivian saw it in the photographs Margot smuggled in during her visits. Grant at charity events, his smile too wide. Grant leaving expensive restaurants, his eyes darting nervously. Grant on the phone, in his car, his expression twisted with frustration. He was spending money he didn't have, assuming the inheritance was already his, acting like a man who had already won. But the estate was tied up in probate, and Celeste Drummond was making sure it stayed that way. He's furious, Celeste reported during their weekly meeting. He expected immediate access to Eleanor's accounts. Instead, every request is being scrutinized, every document reviewed by multiple attorneys. Can he access anything? Not a penny. Eleanor's will was ironclad, and the murder investigation has frozen all assets until the case is resolved. Vivian smiled grimly. Grant had killed for money he couldn't touch. Every day that passed without a conviction was another day. His debts grew larger, his creditors more insistent, his desperation more dangerous. Detective Webb arrived the following morning. His expression was carefully neutral, but something had changed in his demeanor. He moved with purpose now, like a man who had found what he was looking for. I found the neighbor who claimed to hear you screaming at Eleanor, he said. Her name is Patricia Lawson, single mother, 3 kids. And? Grant paid her $15,000 2 days before she gave her statement. The money was deposited into an account in her mother's name. Vivian's heart pounded. That's proof. It's enough to reopen the investigation with Grant as a suspect. Webb leaned forward. But I need more. The evidence against you needs to be discredited completely. What about the pharmacy footage? The enhancement came through this morning. Webb's expression flickered with something like satisfaction. The man in the footage has a distinctive scar on his left hand, from a childhood accident, according to his medical records. Grant had a scar on his left hand, a fishing hook injury from when he was 12. He always made sure to hide it in photographs. You can prove it was him. I can prove it wasn't you. Webb stood. The district attorney is reviewing the case. Your charges may be dropped within the week. After he left, Vivian sat in stunned silence. The nightmare that had consumed her life for weeks was finally ending. The truth was emerging, piece by careful piece, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Grant was still free, still performing for the cameras, still believing he had won. She needed him to confess, to admit what he had done in his own words, to destroy himself completely. Victoria arrived that afternoon with a plan. I've arranged for Grant to visit you tomorrow, ostensibly to discuss the baby's future. She pulled out a document. What he doesn't know is that Detective Webb will be monitoring the conversation. You want me to get him to confess. I want you to give him the opportunity to hang himself. Victoria's smile was sharp. Your husband's weakness is his ego. He needs to be recognized for his cleverness. Push the right buttons, and he won't be able to resist. Vivian nodded slowly. Tucker's words echoed in her memory. If you push him hard enough, he'll slip up. He'll need everyone to know how clever he is. She knew what she had to do. That night, Vivian lay awake in her cell. Tomorrow would determine everything. Her freedom, her daughter's future, Eleanor's legacy. She thought about her mother, about the woman who had chosen a scared 7-year-old from a group home and never stopped fighting for her, about the secret empire Eleanor had built while the world saw only a modest schoolteacher, about the quiet strength that had shaped Vivian into the woman she had become. Eleanor had taught her patience. True patience wasn't passive. It was the hardest kind of action. Waiting for the right moment, gathering strength, striking when the enemy least expected it. Tomorrow was the right moment. Grant had underestimated her from the beginning. He saw what he wanted to see. A vulnerable woman, an easy target, a means to an end. He never saw the survivor, the fighter, the daughter of Eleanor Ashford. His mistake was about to cost him everything. Grant entered the visitation room like a man arriving at his own coronation. His suit was impeccable, his hair perfectly styled, his expression arranged into concerned sympathy. He looked every inch the devoted husband visiting his wrongly accused wife. Vivian watched him approach from behind the reinforced glass. Somewhere nearby, Detective Webb was listening to every word. Sweetheart, Grant sat down gracefully. How are you holding up? Vivian let her shoulders slump, let her voice tremble. Played the part he expected. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. I'm exhausted. The baby is due in 6 weeks. I just want this to be over. Grant's expression flickered with something like satisfaction. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. It will be over soon, I promise. How can you promise that? I've been working with the lawyers. There are options. He reached toward the glass as if to touch her. Trust me. Trust me. The words that had once made her feel safe now made her skin crawl. I need to understand, Vivian said. I need to know why this happened. Why would anyone do this to Eleanor? These things happen. Sometimes there are no answers. But there are answers. Vivian let tears gather in her eyes. The police keep asking about money, about the inheritance. They think I killed my own mother for money I didn't even know existed. Grant's expression remained sympathetic. People believe terrible things about others. Did you know? Know what? About the money. About Eleanor's fortune. Grant was quiet for a moment, calculating, weighing how much to reveal. I had suspicions, he finally admitted. Small things. The way she talked about investments. The artwork she claimed was reproduction, but clearly wasn't. Vivian nodded slowly. You were paying attention. I wanted to understand your family, to be a good son-in-law. The lie rolled off his tongue like silk. Smooth, practiced, utterly convincing. But Vivian wasn't the naive woman he had married anymore. She saw through every word. I've been thinking, she said, about how all of this happened. The evidence, the timing, it's almost like someone planned it perfectly. Grant's eyes flickered, just for a moment. What do you mean? The fingerprints on the medication. I handled that bottle the week before. You were there. You saw me touch it. I remember. And the laptop searches. Someone used my computer while I was at my doctor's appointment. Someone who knew my password. Grant's smile remained fixed, but something shifted behind his eyes. a calculating awareness that hadn't been there before. "What are you saying, Vivian?" She leaned forward, let desperation color her voice. "I need to understand why. What did I do wrong?" The question hung in the air between them. Grant studied her face, searching for deception, finding only the broken woman he expected to see. His ego won. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart." His voice dropped lower, conspiratorial. "You were perfect. The perfect mark." Vivian's heart stopped. "What?" Grant chuckled softly. The sound was chilling. "Did you really think I fell in love with you at first sight? A foster kid with no connections and no money? Please. I don't understand. Your mother was the prize. Always. I knew about her fortune before I ever spoke to you. It took me 2 years to find a way in." His smile widened. "You were the key, the beloved daughter, the path to everything I wanted." In the observation room, Detective Webb signaled to his partner. They had enough, but Vivian needed more. "The medication," she pressed. "How did you—" Grant waved dismissively. Eleanor was predictable. Sunday brunch. Same time, same routine. I visited her alone that Saturday night. One conversation about her heart problems, one suggestion about adjusting her dosage. She handed me everything I needed. And the laptop searches? You really shouldn't share passwords with your husband. Grant laughed. The sound echoed off the concrete walls. It was almost too easy, the perfect crime. The grieving son-in-law supporting his accused wife while quietly inheriting her mother's fortune. But the will? A minor complication. Grant's expression darkened slightly. The charity clause was unexpected. But once you're convicted, I'll contest the terms. Mental instability, undue influence. The estate will be tied up in litigation for years, but I'm a patient man. Vivian stared at the man she had married, the father of her unborn child, the monster who had killed her mother and framed her for murder. "You never loved me," she said. "Love." Grant rolled the word around like something distasteful. "Love is weakness, vulnerability, a tool for manipulation." He smiled. "You wanted so desperately to be loved that you ignored every warning sign. Your mother tried to tell you, that look she gave me at dinner, but you chose to believe in fairy tales instead." Eleanor knew. Of course she knew. She was brilliant, your mother. Saw right through me. His expression hardened. That's why she had to go. She was planning to change the will again, remove you as beneficiary, protect you from me. So you killed her. I removed an obstacle. Grant shrugged, as if discussing a business decision. It's nothing personal, Vivian. You are useful. A means to an end. Once you're convicted, I'll move on to the next opportunity. The door burst open. Officers flooded the room. Detective Webb led the charge, his face set in grim satisfaction. "Grant Porter, you're under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Ashford." Grant's expression transformed. The mask finally fell completely. He lunged toward the glass, his face twisted with rage. "You set me up! You stupid—" The officers restrained him. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He struggled and screamed as they dragged him toward the door. Vivian sat perfectly still. Her hands rested on her belly. Her breathing was calm. "You'll pay for this?" Grant screamed. "I'll destroy you. I'll—" The door slammed shut. His voice faded into the distance. Vivian closed her eyes. The tears that fell now were different from before. Not grief, not despair. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. It was over. The morning Vivian walked out of jail was the first day of her new life. The sunlight hit her face like a blessing. After weeks of fluorescent lights and concrete walls, the warmth felt almost sacred. She stood on the courthouse steps, breathing an air that didn't smell like bleach and despair. Margot reached her first. Her best friend wrapped her in a fierce embrace, careful of her swollen belly. "You did it," Margot whispered. You beautiful, brilliant woman. You did it. Celeste was there too, and Raymond, his stern face softened with something like pride. Even Noel stood at the edge of the crowd, separate but present. The cameras captured everything. The wrongly accused woman finally free, the pregnant widow who had brought her husband to justice, the story that would dominate headlines for weeks. But Vivian barely noticed the reporters. She was too busy remembering how to breathe without fear. 3 weeks later, Eleanor Grace Porter came into the world. The labor lasted 16 hours. Vivian gripped Margot's hand through every contraction, every wave of pain that brought her closer to meeting her daughter. When the baby finally arrived, screaming and perfect and impossibly small, Vivian wept. "Hello, Eleanor," she whispered. "I've been waiting for you." The baby had Grant's dark hair, but Vivian's gray eyes, Eleanor's eyes, a connection to the woman who had saved Vivian's life twice, once from a group home, once from her own husband. Raymond visited that evening. He held his great-niece with surprising gentleness for a man of his years. "She looks like her grandmother," he said. "Same stubborn chin." Vivian smiled. Eleanor would have loved that. She would have loved everything about this. Raymond's voice roughened. "You survived, Vivian. Against impossible odds. My sister would be so proud." The estate took 6 months to settle. Vivian worked closely with Celeste to understand the full scope of Eleanor's fortune. It was staggering. Not just the money, but the responsibility that came with it. Eleanor had left detailed instructions, charitable foundations to maintain, scholarships to fund, lives to change, a legacy of quiet generosity that Vivian was now charged with continuing. "Your mother built all of this in secret," Celeste explained during one of their meetings. "She never wanted recognition, just results." "I understand now why she lived the way she did," Vivian said. "The wealth wasn't the point. The work was the point." "Exactly." Vivian looked out the window of Eleanor's office. Her office now. The garden stretched below, roses blooming in the summer sun. "I want to expand the foster care programs," she said. "Better support for aging out of the system, job training, housing assistance, the things that would have changed my life if Eleanor hadn't found me first." Celeste nodded approvingly. "Your mother would have wanted exactly that." Noelle appeared at the office door. The two women had spent the past months carefully rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't easy. 20 years of bitterness didn't disappear overnight. But they were trying. "The contractor called," Noelle said. "The group home renovation is on schedule. They're naming the library after Mom." Vivian smiled. She would have hated that. "I know. That's why I insisted." Noelle's lips curved into something almost resembling warmth. She spent her whole life avoiding recognition. Time for the world to know what she accomplished. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Grant's lawyers tried every trick. Mental instability, coerced confession, entrapment. Nothing stuck. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony devastating. Tucker Briggs took the stand and detailed Grant's pattern of predatory behavior. Noelle testified about his late-night visit to Eleanor. Detective Webb presented the pharmacy footage, the paid witness, the trail of evidence that proved Grant's meticulous planning. And the confession itself was played for the jury. Grant's own voice, dripping with arrogance, explaining exactly how he had murdered Eleanor and framed Vivian for her death. The verdict came back in less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud. Grant was sentenced to life without parole. Vivian didn't attend the sentencing. She had moved on. Forgiveness wasn't possible, not for what he had done. But hatred required energy she no longer wanted to spend. Instead, she sat in Eleanor's garden with baby Eleanor, sleeping in a bassinet beside her. The roses were blooming. They needed tending. She thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, so desperate to be loved that she ignored every warning sign, so afraid of being alone that she handed her life to a monster. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had survived the unsurvivable, someone who understood that love wasn't about being rescued. It was about rescuing yourself. Her phone rang. Detective Webb's name appeared on the screen. "I wanted to thank you again," Vivian said when she answered. "Actually, I was about to call you." Webb's voice was serious. "We've been investigating Grant's background more thoroughly. There may be other cases, other women. Would you be willing to testify if this goes further?" Vivian looked at her daughter, at the roses, at the future stretching out before her. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he never does this to anyone else." She hung up and lifted baby Eleanor into her arms. The child stirred, opened her eyes, those gray eyes that held so much of the past and all of the future. "I'm going to tell you stories about your grandmother," Vivian whispered, "about how she saved little girls who had no one, about how she built an empire in secret because she didn't need anyone to know her name, about how the strongest people are the ones who survive their own stories." The baby grabbed Vivian's finger, held tight. "And I'm going to tell you about the day I learned that love isn't about being rescued. It's about rescuing yourself." The roses nodded in the afternoon breeze. Somewhere, Vivian swore she heard Eleanor laughing. She had survived her story. Now it was time to write the next chapter. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength, or if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, please share it with them. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. We release new content every week. Stories of women who refused to be broken, women who turned their pain into power. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever ignored warning signs in a relationship? What gave you the strength to finally walk away? Your story matters. Your voice matters. And this community is here to remind you that you are never alone. Thank you for watching until the end. You are stronger than you know. Closing. Disclaimer. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted with intention, designed not just to entertain, but to inspire, empower, and remind you of your own inner strength. We believe stories have the power to heal, and we are honored to share this journey with you.